There is a door bar above the eastern alcove that I have never once mistaken for an ornament. It is a length of dark wood, no more splendid than good walnut at a glance, iron-capped at both ends and worn smooth where hands once closed around it in haste, routine, fear, and weathered habit. Runes are burned into one face, shallow and smoke-black, nearly illegible unless the candle is angled low. They are not the sort of runes merchants like to invent for souvenirs when they wish to sell provincial mystique to urban collectors who cannot tell a prayer from a receipt. These are practical things, border runes, threshold words, not spells in the vulgar sense, not some gaudy promise that the stick itself will hurl lightning if held by the righteous. Rather, the old sober grammar of a people who understood that survival often begins with deciding what shall not be admitted. I found it in a ruined storehouse near the old coast, buried beneath fishhooks, storm-split planks, and the charred remnants of ledgers no mildew had been kind enough to finish. Once, I think, it barred the inner door of a hall used by militia captains or village elders, somewhere ordinary enough not to earn itself a name in the grand histories and therefore important in the only way that really counts. Great empires are fond of palaces. Small realms, especially those accustomed to dangerous neighbors, learn the holiness of hinges, watchfires, and the firm slide of wood across a door at dusk. You can tell a great deal about a civilization by the objects it chooses to decorate. You can tell more by the objects it chooses to touch every day. This bar was handled by nervous hands, competent hands, hands calloused by rope and wet timber, hands that knew the difference between hospitality and surrender. It belongs, therefore, to Aglarond. Welcome back to the Hidden Stacks. I am Aurelian Cantonine, Belnorn Law Warden, custodian of old continuities, witness against simplification, and fond adversary of every mapmaker who labels a borderland peripheral because he has not yet had the courtesy to be frightened there. This is the Lich's Tale, a Faerûn Lorecast. We remain in the second season, Realms Between Ruins, the long age of kingdoms. Last season, we walked the immense chronology of Faerûn, from the mythic beginnings of world and power through the creator races, the cataclysms that remade land and species, the old ages of dragons and giants, the flowering and fracture of the elder elven world, the crown wars, the founding time, the great human empires, Netheril's brilliance and collapse, Mithranna's noble gamble, the rise of factions that learned how to outlive dynasties, the time of troubles, the spell plague, and the Second Sundering's severe breathing space. This season has asked a quieter question, and for that reason, a more intimate one. After the old catastrophes, who inherited the world? Who found roads already half-buried, groves already sacred, towers already broken, trade routes already contested, laws already fossilizing, and grievances already waiting in the dark like patient creditors? What did they build upon the remains? What did they understand? What did they mistake for destiny merely because it had survived long enough to look inevitable? We began by refusing the childish fantasy of empty land. Faerûn, we said, is no blank wilderness waiting for the first confident claimant to make it meaningful. It is an overwritten manuscript. Charmdath then showed us a human empire founded not upon enthroned gods or floating wonders, but upon disciplined mind and psionic statecraft. Mulhorand and Unther taught us what becomes of law, labor, and civic memory when divinity enters government so thoroughly that tax and temple begin to speak with one mouth. Chesenta and Chondath turned the Vilhon Reach into a lesson on offended pride, militarized trade, and the tempo of city-state ambition. Kalimshan showed us continuity so old that conquest altered dynasties more readily than reflexes. The Shun Imperium demonstrated that empires often continue after wisdom has left the room simply because their institutions have forgotten how not to expand. Amn and Tether placed coin and bloodline side by side as neighboring failures of legitimacy. Chult corrected the northern vice of mistaking another people's sacred homeland for an exotic edge. The North taught us that danger does not merely threaten culture there, it manufactures it. Cormyr proved that monarchy endures only when it is forced into institutions stronger than romance. The Dale lands and Sembia made local freedom and merchant appetite stare at one another across a permanent and profitable unease. The Moonsea hardened frontier wealth into iron politics. Rashemen, with its witches, lodges, spirits, and rituals of defiant coherence, showed us a society whose power outsiders repeatedly mismeasured because it was not eager to become legible on imperial terms. And last time, in Thai, we walked through the nightmare opposite. We studied a realm terrifying not merely because it is cruel, though it is, but because it is organized. Magical specialization, slaving estates, Zulkir rivalries, bureaucratic appetite, exportable wickedness, and the chill efficiency with which a wizard state can standardize fear. If Rashemen taught us how a people may survive by refusing to make itself easily measurable, they taught us what happens when measurement itself becomes an instrument of domination. Tonight, we do not travel far on the map, but morally, we cross a gulf. We go to Aglarond, to a realm of coast and cliff, of old woods and mixed blood, of stubborn localisms and royal magic, of half-elven inheritance and human settlement, of ancient menhir circles and practical militias, of deep suspicion toward conquest, and even deeper suspicion toward those who claim conquest is merely a more efficient form of order. We go to a state whose central political act over centuries was not expansion, not conversion, not annexation, not glorious reconquest, but refusal. No to absorption. No to simplification. No to being told that strength must resemble Thay in order to count as strength. No to the notion that a borderland is merely unfinished empire waiting for a stronger hand. This is important. Many chroniclers, particularly those who write from large courts or commercial cities, suffer from a vulgar habit of mind. They assume that all realms aspire in secret to become bigger versions of themselves, more territory, more tax, more ports, more grain, more roads, more obedient districts, more reasons for the scribes to request fresh shelving. If a realm does not behave that way, they call it weak, quaint, erratic, or incomplete. They cannot imagine that a people might have measured the price of enlargement and declined to pay it. Aglarond is one of Faerûn's finest rebukes to that stupidity. It survives not by pretending the appetite of stronger neighbors does not exist, nor by matching those neighbors province for province, atrocity for atrocity, archive for archive. It survives by cultivating a culture that understands the difference between openness and permeability, between mixed inheritance and self-erasure, between hospitality and access, between heroism and overdependence upon heroes. That last matter will trouble us before the night is over. For Aglarond's greatness, like the greatness of many small but durable realms, contains a built-in anxiety. What happens when a people survives for generations under the shelter of a singular protector? What habits of courage does that produce? What laziness of institutional imagination may it also conceal? When a realm's border is guarded by forests, militias, old magics, stubborn local memory, and one of the most formidable sorceresses in Faerûn, is that a model of resilience, or a structure resting too much of itself upon a living miracle? Ah, there is the hinge. We shall open it carefully. But before we enter the forest and the border halls, a word from the sponsor who keeps our own humble infrastructure from collapsing into mold, dust, and Baelnorn muttering. This episode is brought to you by Dharma Web Solutions. If you need web design and development built for clarity, durability, and the long maintenance that proves whether the original vision deserved to survive contact with the living world, visit dharmawebsolutions.com. Choose builders who understand that every structure, digital or otherwise, must eventually endure revisions, strange user behavior, edge cases, shifting expectations, and the insulting certainty that tomorrow will discover one more dependency no one documented properly. A small realm survives by understanding thresholds. A good website survives by understanding them too. Now then, let us begin where Aglarond itself begins, before Aglarond. Long before half-elven kings, before the symbol, before red wizards learned to snarl at the forest line with a mixture of envy and professional irritation, the peninsula was the Weirwood. Do not imagine merely trees. People who do not live with forests often think a wood is absence with bark. They look at a map, see green, and interpret silence. But a forest, especially an old and inhabited one, is never empty. It is road, memory, pantry, shrine, boundary, camouflage, archive, and argument all at once. In the Weirwood, that truth was sharpened by age and by the layered presences that preceded Aglarond's founding. The earliest histories relevant to our purposes speak first of the Weir, a people associated in some traditions primarily with wild elves, in others with a broader elven milieu later joined by star elves. I am precise here because the record thickens rather than clarifies as one moves backward. Borderlands are troublesome enough. Borderlands layered atop older, partly withdrawn elven polities become treacherous to summarize. We know, however, that the Weirwood was no accidental thicket. It held ceremonial sites, menhir circles, deep magical practice, and an inherited sacred geography strong enough to outlive the people who first named large parts of it. The Weir revered the Seldarine, yes, but not only the Seldarine. They also honored local divine powers of the forest, whose memory later cultures never entirely erased. Relkath of the Infinite Branches, Zandilar the Dancer, Elikarashe. That alone should tell you something important. This was not a place of second-hand piety. It generated theological localism. That matters because places capable of generating their own sacred grammar often prove extremely difficult to absorb. They cannot be annexed merely by replacing officials. Too much meaning is embedded in glades, stones, streams, and inherited rights. The Weirwood's famous menhir circles are part of this same older pattern. Even in later ages, when moss and time swallowed their edges and casual travelers mistook them for picturesque relics, they remained what they had always been: infrastructure disguised as mystery, portals, thresholds, ways of moving through the forest and beyond it without asking permission of more obvious roads. Some linked distant reaches of the wood, some opened to other places on Toril, some, in later traditions, touched Sildayuir, the extra-dimensional refuge of the Star Elves. Knowledge of their workings was not public. Of course it was not. Civilizations that survive pressure rarely publish all their arteries. Yet the circles remained part of the region's deep habit of controlled access. Notice the pattern already emerging. Aglarond, even before it existed, grew from a landscape where movement was selective, belonging was layered, and thresholds mattered more than straight roads. By the late founding time and the centuries after, Star Elves gathered in the Uerwood, and with green or wild elven kin already there, helped form the realm of Uereshanyar. The dates matter less here than the civilizational logic. This was an elven answer to pressure. The Uerwood's people did not seek imperial centrality. They sought continuity by concentrating power in place, in ritual, and in magical systems that made the forest itself part of the polity. Yet even that answer was not left in peace. Human powers to the west and south pressed. Unther contested the coast. Orkgate violence rippled outward during the great wars of the old empires. By later centuries, faced with accumulated threats and encroachments, the high mages of Uereshanyar shaped a still more dramatic refusal. Through the Menhir network and high magic, they wrought Sildayuir, an extra-dimensional refuge, and at last, many of the Star Elves abandoned the Uerwood for that hidden elsewhere. You may call that retreat if you like. I would call it a highly elven form of saying no. Not conquest, not martyrdom, not assimilation. Withdrawal with architecture. The forest remembers such decisions. This is one of the subtler truths shaping Aglarond thereafter. The peninsula's political imagination was marked, long before the kingdom formed, by repeated acts of selective refusal. Refusal to surrender sacred terrain entirely. Refusal to fight every war on terms chosen by outsiders. Refusal, when the pressure became unbearable, to remain fully available to the world that would not leave the place alone. Even absence became a kind of border policy. Now, do not sentimentalize this. Uereshanyar was not a perfect sanctuary ruined solely by foreign wickedness. No borderland remains blameless for millennia. The record preserves internal strains, civil conflicts, shifting priorities among elven groups, and the familiar aristocratic tendency to discover disagreement only after it has matured into structural weakness. But the larger point stands. The Uerwood did not begin as blank land, later civilized by humans or half-elves. It began as a place already thick with prior sovereignty, prior magic, prior devotion, and prior withdrawals. That is why maps lie when they show forest as empty green. They erase the first number. They erase the second and the third. They make it look as though later claimants discovered a landscape instead of inheriting a debate. By the time human fisherfolk and settlers increased along the coast in the 8th century Dale reckoning, the Uerwood had already endured pressures from drow, mountain trolls, declining elven populations, and the long attrition by which a forest polity can remain sacred while becoming demographically fragile. Human arrivals, many of Unterich or Chessentan stock by later descent, others from elsewhere, founded coastal settlements such as Korth, Ingdal's Arm, and Velprintelar. They came by sea because the sea, as we shall discuss more fully in our next episode, has no respect for tidy regional isolation. Boats bring fishers, traders, colonists, saints, pirates, refugees, younger sons, debtors, and opportunists in roughly equal measure. They also bring habits. One of those habits is clearing land. A fishing settlement may live with the coast. A growing coastal culture always wants timber, fields, room for houses, room for roads, room for tomorrow's cousins, room for defensive lines, room for cattle, room for the sort of practical expansion every settler calls necessity once enough people are invested in it. So the outer Uir wood retreated. Rewards were offered to adventurers and hard men willing to drive hostile creatures from the trees. The old forest line was not overrun in one dramatic campaign worthy of heroic tapestry. It was nibbled, fenced, logged, and pushed. This is how sacred geographies often die in ordinary history, not always beneath fireballs, but under axes, grazing patterns, and the explanatory tone of those who insist they are merely making the land useful. Yet the Uir themselves did not vanish in one clean line either. Beset by drow and mountain trolls, disease, and the demographic exhaustion of too many pressures at once, they were aided by humans in some fights, even as those same humans pressed deeper into the wood. Intermarriage followed. Half-elven descendants emerged, proud of their Uir inheritance, shaped by elven memory and human practicality alike. Here, the peninsula produced the population that would later make Aglarond possible. And note the moral texture of that birth. Aglarond's people do not descend from purity. They descend from coexistence under strain, from alliance and encroachment, from rescue and displacement, from shared blood and contested land. That is one reason Aglarond is so resistant to simplification. Its founding people embody a contradiction too intimate to be theorized away. They are living proof that mixture does not resolve conflict, but neither does conflict prevent mixture. Borderlands are full of such truths, which is why ideologues hate them. A mixed people standing stubbornly in place offends every tidy doctrine of clean inheritance. In the Uirwood, this tension sharpened. Humans kept expanding settlements and farms. Half-elves, increasingly conscious of what was being lost, objected. The humans did not listen closely enough, or perhaps listened and calculated that pressure would prevail. Either way, what had been a slowly worsening dispute became a war of succession over the land's meaning. Was the peninsula a colonist's coast with a forest still waiting to be properly subdued? Or was it still, fundamentally, a Uir inheritance with human settlement, tolerated only so far as it respected older claims? You know the answer history gave in 1065 DR. At the Battle of Ingdal's Arm, Bryndr Olosin led the half-elf army to victory over the human forces of Queen Indrila Demaz. And here the story does something intelligent. The victors did not exterminate the humans or drive every settler into the sea. They negotiated the creation of a new kingdom, Aglarond, with Brindor as its first king. Some humans stayed under the new half-elf monarchy, others departed for Ultumbel or the Fang. A border war thus became a founding bargain. This is the second great refusal that defines Aglarond. The half-elves said no to continued encroachment. Then, having won the right to say it with weapons, they said no also to the easier intoxication of pure revenge. Instead, they built a realm in which mixed inheritance became constitutional fact. Do not miss how unusual that is. Many realms are born from conquest. Fewer are born from conquest immediately translated into negotiated coexistence under the authority of the formerly marginalized. Fewer still preserve that arrangement for centuries with enough seriousness to produce a durable political identity rather than a brief interlude before one side resumes trying to erase the other. Aglarond is not innocent, but it is interesting in the right ways. And it becomes more interesting still once Brindor begins to give that new compromise, walls, roads, soldiers and habits, strong enough to survive both memory and envy. Brindor Olosina deserves more attention than he usually receives. This happens often in histories dominated by brighter sorceress figures. Founders who wield organization rather than apocalyptic spellcraft are routinely underpraised because the archive, like the tavern, remembers spectacle more easily than maintenance. Yet maintenance is what makes a kingdom. Brindor, first half-elf king of Aglarond, did not merely win a battle and sit poetically beneath the trees while posterity composed flattering songs. He built an army. He established fortifications. He put defensive intelligence into stone and timber. He turned a negotiated settlement into a state. That transformation matters. Victories settle arguments for a season. Institutions decide whether the argument will resume next spring. Under Brindor, Aglarond gained its own army and a set of defensive works fitted to its geography rather than copied from some inland model. Emech, later called Undumor, guarded approaches. Glaronda anchored the realm's military presence. The watchwall marked more than a line. It marked a decision to invest labor in continuity. This is the practical face of sovereignty. Not merely a crown, not merely a treaty, but the repeated expenditure of effort to make a founding bargain survivable. It is also here that Aglarond's style becomes visible. This was not a realm with the appetite or perhaps the available population to sustain huge marching armies for distant wars. It built small, skilled forces, border fortifications, and later the traditions from which the famed foresters would emerge. Local knowledge mattered. Terrain mattered. Alertness mattered. If they leaned increasingly toward the logic of the organized magical state, and Rashemen toward the distributed force of right, lodge, and spirit-backed resolve. Aglarond developed a border monarchy that relied upon selective professionalism, braided together with local militias and the lived intelligence of people who actually knew the ground. You may think this unglamorous. That is because you have not watched many ambitious realms die of glamour. Aglarond's geography rewarded prudence. The peninsula is not vast, yet it is not conveniently simple either. Coasts, inlets, cliffs, forests, marshy approaches, and choke points all complicate movement. The Ure wood is not merely cover. It is social territory, cultural memory, and defensive medium. A road through such a land is useful, yes, but it is also a liability unless watched. Harbors invite trade, but they also invite raid, espionage, and migration, one may later call infiltration, if the migrants turn out less grateful than the sponsors had hoped. Even the sea is double-faced here. It connects Aglarond to larger circuits of exchange while making those same circuits impossible to ignore. Small realms on important water rarely enjoy the privilege of irrelevance. And so Aglarond learned balance. Its army, later famous for foresters operating in and around the Ure wood, remained comparatively small but skilled. Local militias formed an indispensable second line. No vast formal navy defined the kingdom. Instead, practical boats and coastal expertise provided mobility where needed. This is what I mean when I say some realms survive by disciplined refusal. They refuse to spend themselves pretending to be larger than they are. They invest where their landscape multiplies effort. They prefer competence in the right places to grandeur in the wrong ones. There is an intellectual dignity in that. It is not the same thing as safety. For Aglarond's early centuries reveal the permanent borderland problem. Once a mixed polity proves itself durable, neighbors begin testing it not merely for land, but for definition. Is this kingdom a true realm or a temporary compromise? Is the half-elven monarchy a strange local arrangement or a stable form of sovereignty? Can a state founded on negotiated coexistence maintain enough coherence to repel more centralized powers? These are not abstract questions when your kings keep being asked to answer them with dead soldiers. Brindor's son Althon improved security further and repaired damage in the Ure wood, a detail worth lingering on. Repairing the forest is not a decorative act in a realm like this. It is public policy. It means the monarchy understood that the wood was not scenery around the state, but part of its living foundation. Contrast this with empires that treat forests as raw material awaiting conversion. In Aglarond, damaged woodland was a political concern because it was bound up with the legitimacy of the founding people. Then came the ugly lesson. Elthond, Althon's son, was killed by invaders from Thay at the Battle of Singing Sands in 1194 DR. His brother Philispur succeeded him and in turn died only 3 years later, again at Thayan hands, at the Battle of Broken Heads. Pause and appreciate the pressure that applies to a young kingdom. 2 kings lost in quick succession to the same southern neighbor. If you wish to break such a realm, this is how you might proceed. Kill continuity, force emergency succession, teach every district that the crown is mortal and border defense expensive. Wait for panic to do the rest. Aglarond did not oblige. The crown passed to the Grey Sisters, Thara and Ulai Olosin, mage queens ruling jointly. Again, the realm reveals its flexibility. A brittle polity often collapses when succession stops resembling an older masculine military line. Aglarond adapted. One sister excelled in magic and diplomacy, the other in war. One married into Thesk, reinforcing eastern ties. The other wed a forester, symbolically and materially binding crown to local military tradition. I find that particularly elegant. Dynastic politics is often treated as sterile genealogy. In reality, it is architecture made of marriage. Aglarond used marriage not only upward toward external alliance, but inward toward the practical people who kept the woods and marches intelligible. This is a small kingdom's intelligence. It cannot afford to float above its own local muscle. When both sisters died within days of each other, the throne passed again, this time to Halakar, the first full human ruler of Aglarond. Observe the significance. The realm founded by half-elves did not collapse when a human inherited the crown. That would have pleased ideologues on every side, but history seldom grants them such flattering vindication. Instead, the mixed nature of Aglarond had become politically real enough that a human king could sit the throne without unmaking the state, which is not the same thing as succeeding wisely. In 1260, Dr. Halakar led a campaign into Thai. It was catastrophic. Aglarondan forces were driven back, though they managed to repel the oncoming fiendish elements in the retreat. Halakar died the same year, widely believed poisoned at Red Wizard instigation. There is much to learn from this miserable episode. Small resistant realms frequently nurse the dream of decisive punitive action against their larger predators. Sometimes they must strike. But when they cross into the enemy's preferred theater without overwhelming advantage, they often discover that defensive coherence does not automatically translate into offensive dominance. Aglarond was better at saying no than at dictating yes. That is not a weakness in itself. It becomes one only when pride forgets the difference. Halakar's failure likely taught the realm what they had been trying to teach it by force. If Aglarond was to live, it must not become a lesser imitation of its enemy. It could not beat Thay by turning into a minor magocracy with prettier trees. It had to survive by a different civilizational grammar. Ilione, Halakar's sister, seems to have understood this better. A powerful spellcaster, she rebuilt Aglarond's military strength and steadied the realm after disaster. She is one of those transitional rulers historians too often use merely as a bridge toward brighter names. That is unfair. Stabilizers matter. They hand posterity something other than rubble. When plague later carried her off in 1320 DR, she left behind a kingdom still standing, still distinct, and prepared, though perhaps not knowingly, for its most famous sovereign. Before we reach that witch queen, however, we need to remain a little longer among ordinary Aglarondans. For the art of saying no is not practiced only by monarchs and sorceresses. It lives in settlement patterns, diets, prejudices, tolerated ambiguities, port habits, and the way a people decides who may enter the house and which stories must be told before supper. A realm built from mixed populations and defended under pressure does not have the luxury of being abstract. Its politics are daily. On the coast, Aglarondan human communities remained oriented toward agriculture, fishing, and herding. These were hardy working people, practical and often more concerned with weather than with metaphysical programs. Their settlements were the first human footholds on the peninsula, so coastal life retained older colonial traces even after the kingdom's founding reversed political dominance. Dress, speech, and custom varied by region. Some Western communities bore the marks of piratical ancestry and rough maritime habit. Eastern communities leaned into brighter cloth and ornament, yet all of them lived within the kingdom's larger discipline of vigilance. A fisher village in Aglarond is not merely a village, it is a shoreline sensor. Every incoming sail might be trade, it might also be trouble. Within and around the Uirwood, half-elven communities preserve different rhythms. Those nearer human settlements often adopted houses, market habits, and mixed domestic forms more legible to outsiders. Those deeper in the wood kept closer to older elven ways, smaller communities, semi-nomadic patterns in some cases, hunting, gathering, localized magic, and stronger attachment to the forest's internal sacred geography. Wild elves remained present as well. Already you can see why Aglarond resists easy classification. It is not one people flattened into a single civic style. It is a negotiated field of proximities, coast and wood, human and half-elf and elf, market and glade, crown and locality. Such a realm survives only if its differences can be made politically load-bearing rather than fatal. Aglarond managed this more often than one would reasonably expect. Not always gracefully, not always justly, but often enough to matter. Let us dwell there, because daily life is where a realm's philosophy either becomes breathable or rots into proclamation. What does it mean to live in Aglarond if you are not the monarch, not the border captain, not the sorceress upon whom neighboring tyrants build nightmares before sleep? It means first that the kingdom asks you to participate in vigilance without requiring that you live in a state of theatrical mobilization. This is not Thai, where the citizen is always 1 degree away from being material, nor is it Rashamen, where ritual and lodge structures penetrate civic life with a seasonal intensity foreigners often misread as constant frenzy. Aglarond is subtler. Its people farm, fish, herd, weave, cut timber, cure nets, bargain for glass and iron, mend coast boats, press blood wine, raise children, argue over inheritance, distrust outsiders with varying degrees of politeness, and know, without needing a herald to remind them every dawn, that they inhabit a realm whose softness would be fatal. The economy reflects that mentality. Aglarond was broadly self-sufficient, producing most of what it needed, and only a modest surplus for trade. That is more than an economic fact. It is political posture. A small border realm that can feed and clothe itself is harder to coerce than one whose luxuries have become necessities. Aglarond exported copper, gems, grain, lumber, and its own blood wine. The half-elven communities of the Uirwood produced instruments and delicate works of wood and silver. Imports existed: glass, iron, textiles, the usual refinements and gaps. But the kingdom did not fling itself eagerly into every passing circuit of profit. It admitted a limited number of traders rather than making openness into doctrine. Some larger commercial states would call this provincial. I call it strategic modesty. Trade is a gift to the strong and a temptation to the vulnerable. The more necessary it becomes, the more entry points one must defend, the more foreign disputes one imports, the more leverage accumulates in outside hands, and the more local elites begin confusing increased volume with increased wisdom. Aglarond knew enough of the sea to benefit from it while never becoming spiritually coastal in the careless way some merchant cities do. Sea trade mattered, certainly, but the sea did not define the kingdom's soul. The forest and the border did. This is another form of saying no. No to abundance purchased at the price of permeability. No to the fantasy that every open gate is wealth and none are vectors. No to allowing the measure of the realm to be set by what passes through its harbours rather than by what remains intact when the ships have gone. Religion in Aglarond likewise resists neatness. The peninsula inherited layers. Old Uir sacred forms lingered in the wood. The Seldarine remained present through elven and half-elven continuities. Human settlers brought their own devotions. The great standing stones at places like the Sunglade encoded these accumulations visibly. Outer rings recalling the familiar Seldarine. Inner dedications pointing toward elder local powers now half forgotten, except by those who knew how to read the forest without demanding it speak in universal terms. This is not clutter. It is the religious equivalent of mixed blood. It produces both richness and tension. A kingdom built atop such strata cannot define itself by singular orthodoxy without amputating part of its own past. Aglarond therefore developed a devotional texture more layered than dogmatic. This did not mean everyone agreed amiably around campfires while passing fruit and insights. Do not insult history with such syrup. It means instead that the realm's sacred life, particularly around the yearwood, remained too entangled with place and ancestry to be pressed into a single imported mold. A borderland that remembers several gods in several voices is harder to annex spiritually than a young colony whose pantheon arrived whole in the same ships as its legal codes. There is also the matter of magic. Here, Aglarond becomes especially instructive because it refuses easy assumptions. One might expect a kingdom of old menhirs, half-elven forest communities, and eventually the symbols rule to normalize magic at every social level. In truth, the attitude was more complicated. Among ordinary human Aglarondans, magic was often regarded as something best handled by those in authority, rather than treated as a cheerful part of daily domestic life. Gifted children might be drawn into apprenticeship under structures tied to the monarch. Common folk could respect magic and distrust it at once. They may have lived under spell-casting rulers, but that did not mean they wanted every cousin waving cantrips over the soup. This is sensible. A people living beside Thay would develop a sharp nose for the difference between power that protects and power that begins explaining why it deserves broader privileges. Among half-elves, particularly in the Uirwood, magic was more widely practiced. Totemic traditions persisted. The old menhir knowledge survived in fragments. Forest communities maintained ritual and practical magical forms, not always legible to coastal settlements. Again, the kingdom reveals its duality. Magic is both central and suspect, both part of the realm's defense and something ordinary people do not necessarily wish to democratize indiscriminately. I find this one of Aglarond's sanest traits. Admiration without naivete. The realm values power without romanticizing widespread casual access to it. It knows too well what its southern neighbor has done with the art. It knows too how much of its own survival may depend on rare individuals capable of wielding that same force without succumbing to Thaian habits. Daily life therefore varies by district and ancestry, yet the broad pattern holds. Coastal humans live practical, labor-heavy lives with a wary respect for crown and magic. Half-elves in outer forest communities adapt more readily to mixed forms. Those deeper in the wood preserve more visibly elven or Ur-descended habits, and often a sharper suspicion of outsiders, including coastal Aglarondans. Wild elves remain near enough to complicate every crude demographic simplification. A kingdom like this cannot be governed intelligently by pretending its differences do not exist. It must instead build a political culture capable of letting those differences remain without continuously becoming secession. This is harder than empire. Empire can simply rank. Aglarond had to negotiate. That negotiation appears in its structures. Under the Olosine monarchy, the king or queen was advised by a council drawn from major cities and smaller settlements alike. Every community was notionally entitled to representation, though rougher edge regions did not always fully acknowledge central authority. How delightful! A state is healthiest, in my experience, when even its disobedience is documented. The point is not that Aglarond achieved perfect constitutional harmony. The point is that its government reflected the need to balance local realities rather than annihilate them administratively. And local realities here were stubborn indeed. A coast village worried about ships, taxes, storms, pirates, and grain stores. A Yearwood settlement worried about sacred clearings, strange footprints, whether the old portals were behaving, whether the crown understood the forest well enough to be obeyed today, and whether the next generation would forget the names of the older gods. A border captain worried about Thay. Everyone, in one way or another, worried about Thay. But the worry did not produce uniformity. That may be Aglarond's most impressive civic achievement. Fear often simplifies. It drives polities towards central control, ideological purges, suspicion of mixed populations, and the ugly comfort of declaring one way of life the only sufficiently patriotic one. Aglarond, for all its tensions, did not surrender wholly to that temptation. Indeed, its mixed populations became one of its strategic resources. Humans knew the coasts and settlements. Half-elves knew the wood and its moods. Wild elves carried older forest habits and contacts. The crown could draw on each without requiring complete sameness from all. That does not mean ethnic peace reigned like a benevolent weather pattern. There were tensions. Some half-elves near the human settlements adopted more human ways. Others, deeper in the Yearwood, clung to older elven models of life and did not regard coastal expansion with affection. Rumors persisted of those who would have preferred the humans gone entirely. One understands the sentiment even when one declines the policy. Yet the large fact remains that Aglarond's political identity depended upon not resolving its mixed inheritance through exclusion. It is here that the realm's refusal becomes most ethically interesting. Aglarond says no not only to conquerors, it says no also to the seductive brutality of purity. No to the idea that only one ancestry can define the land. No to the assumption that mixed peoples are temporary, compromised, or spiritually shallow. No to the cynical calculation that a kingdom under pressure must simplify itself in order to survive. This is why Aglarond matters beyond regional color. In a world where so many powers justify themselves through claims of destiny, blood, ancient right, or magical merit, Aglarond persists as a state built from the management of overlap. It is not some utopian paradise of cheerful coexistence. It is better than that, because it is true enough to be durable. It shows coexistence as work. Work conducted under conditions that would make easier people's reach for cleaner hatreds. Of course, such work is rarely enough by itself. A realm may possess admirable social texture and still be devoured if it lacks military edge or symbolic force. Aglarond had both. The first lay in its small, skilled armies, militias, and later the foresters. The second increasingly gathered around its monarchs, above all around the woman history knows as the symbol. And here, my apprentice, we reach the dangerous blessing at the kingdom's heart. Alasra Shentrantra, the symbol, enters Aglarondan history like weather over open water. One does not mistake her for an ordinary sovereign. She was named successor by Queen Ilione and rose to rule after the plague-taken queen's death in 1320 DR. Already famed as one of the Seven Sisters and as a chosen of Mistra, she brought to the throne an intensity of magical presence that altered the kingdom's strategic profile simply by existing. Neighbors did not have to admire her. They only had to calculate her. For Thay in particular, that meant something close to permanent irritation. A small realm defended by woods, militias, and border forts is one problem. The same realm defended by all that, plus a sorceress, some judged the peer of Elminster, and Kelban becomes another species altogether. The symbol's reputation is almost too large for sober history, which is why sober history must insist upon structure rather than merely gape. Yes, she was overwhelmingly powerful. Yes, she was unpredictable. Yes, she carried that useful mingling of brilliance and danger that makes enemies cautious and allies devoted past prudence. But the important question is not whether she could hurl this or shatter that. The important question is what it does to a realm when such a person stands at its center for generations. Aglarond, under the symbol, became a kingdom with a deterrent aura. They could still probe, threaten, intrigue, scheme, and strike indirectly. But open conquest had to reckon not only with the forest and the militias and the old defensive works, but with the possibility that the Witch Queen herself would answer. The psychological effect of that is hard to overstate. Deterrence is not merely military capacity. It is the enemy's fear of uncertainty. The symbol specialized in uncertainty. Thay, organized though it was, did not enjoy confronting forces that refused to remain inside expected patterns. This made her invaluable. It also made her dangerous to Aglarond in a quieter way. For when a realm begins to rely upon singular brilliance, it risks turning ordinary institutional development into something forever deferrable. Why strengthen every office to the utmost when the Queen herself can burn holes through strategic dilemmas? Why cultivate wider confidence when the monarchy is embodied in a living legend? Why imagine succession clearly when the current sovereign seems less like a person than a permanent condition of the weather? History punishes such laziness eventually. The symbol's greatness, in other words, was real and double-edged. She protected Aglarond magnificently. She also made it easier for Aglarond to believe that protection might continue in personal rather than institutional form. This is not a criticism of her character so much as a law of political gravity. Charismatic protectors save realms. Their magnitude bends the surrounding structures. Sometimes the structures grow stronger under that pressure. Sometimes they become decorative, assuming the Great One will always arrive in time. Aglarond's case lies uneasily between those outcomes. To understand why, one must look not only at the Queen's power, but at the society she ruled. The symbol did not sit atop a blank population awaiting heroic animation. She ruled a realm already shaped by mixed inheritance, local suspicion, self-sufficiency, and the long defensive habits we have traced. In that sense, she amplified a pre-existing pattern. She was not Aglarond's entire answer to Thay. She was the most incandescent expression of an answer the kingdom had been developing for centuries. Thay organizes power hierarchically and exportably. Aglarond localizes and personalizes it without allowing locality to fragment into helplessness. Thay trusts systems of training, caste, specialization, and discipline sharpened by fear. Aglarond trusts terrain, mixed social intelligence, practical arms, old magics, and a sovereign whose relation to the art is intimate enough to frighten professional sorcerers. Thay says power must be legible, ranked, and administratively available. Aglarond replies that power may also be wild, place-bound, relational, and morally tethered to defense rather than expansion. The symbol gave that reply a face, or perhaps several faces. Sovereigns of her sort are always partly personal and partly emblematic. She was a woman, certainly, learned, dangerous, idiosyncratic, deeply entangled in the wider magical and divine currents of Faerûn. She was also an institution of morale. For ordinary Aglarondans, her rule likely had contradictory meanings. To some, she was guardian, distant but fierce. To others, she was unnerving proof that monarchy could become nearly superhuman and therefore difficult to question in ordinary ways. To Yerwood folk, she was often acceptable as a defender, while still not exempting the central government from local suspicion. To Thay, she was the intolerable fact that smaller neighbors sometimes acquire champions one cannot reliably model. There are few things a wizard state hates more than an unmodelable variable. Now, it would be easy, too easy, to tell the symbol's story as though Aglarond thereafter consisted simply of her blasting back red wizards, while the grateful kingdom lived in suspended admiration. That is the sort of simplification fit for cheap broadsheets, not shelves. Real rule is denser than that. Under the Olosin line and into the symbol's era, Aglarond retained councils, communities, local traditions, and regional distinctions. The army remained relatively small and skilled. The foresters, elite rangers, loyal to the crown, operated in the Yerwood with a degree of competence no invading planner could afford to discount. Clarendar anchored one pole of defense. Emek, later Undumor, anchored another. Militia traditions allowed ordinary citizens to reinforce trained forces in times of serious threat. Aglarond had no great formal navy, yet its coast boats enabled swift transportation and raiding along the shores. This is important. A small realm need not mirror every institution of a large power if it can align limited institutions with terrain and habit. Here again, The symbol's role was amplification rather than replacement. She mattered because the kingdom already knew how to resist. But she also changed what resistance could mean. A border incursion against a merely martial realm might be answered with scouts, pikes, tariffs, and fort repairs. Against Aglarond, under the symbol, it might also be answered by arcane devastation, counter-intrigue, and the personal fury of a chosen. This widened the strategic menu dramatically. It also allowed the crown to recruit and cultivate magical talent more selectively. Children gifted in the art could be drawn into apprenticeships associated with the throne. The crown could treat arcane capacity as a guarded state resource without adopting Thay's caste system. Again, we see Aglarond refusing both extremes. It did not democratize magic naively. It did not bureaucratize magic monstrously. It domesticated magic just enough to yoke it to defense and rulership without surrendering society entirely to a mage oligarchy. That balance is one reason Aglarond feels so different from Thay, even when both realms produce formidable spellcasters. In Thay, magical ability is root, rank, and often justification. In Aglarond, magical ability at the highest levels is crown-adjacent, necessary, and dangerous, but not the sole organizing principle of society. The farmers still farm, the fishers still fish. The ewerwood still insists on being older than the tax rolls. The local militia still matters. A kingdom ruled by a sorceress remains stubbornly a kingdom rather than a research pyramid with provinces attached. One might call this healthy. One would also need to admit the strain. For the greater the symbol loomed, the harder it became to imagine Aglarond without her. This is the paradox of successful protectors. They make the future possible by making the present survivable. Yet if they dominate the imagination too completely, the future arrives structurally underprepared for their absence. A people defended for too long by someone exceptional begins to mistake exception for system. I do not say Aglarond wholly succumbed to that error. It had too much local resilience for that. The ewerwood did not forget itself because one queen breathed. Coastal villages did not forget how to arm because the palace glowed. Yet the danger remained. Some ewerwood half-elves and wild elves later distrusted authorities who attempted to inherit the symbol's mantle institutionally. The very fact of their skepticism tells you something. They could accept the queen. They were less eager to accept bureaucracy clothed in her after-image. This is the charismatic protector problem in perfect miniature. A singular ruler may be loved, feared, or at least accepted because her personal bond to place feels authentic. But once institutions seek to continue her reach without her living presence, populations ask a cruel and sensible question. Are we being guarded or merely governed in the name of a ghost? That question would haunt Aglarond later after the symbol's apparent death and the rise of the Simbark Council. I mention that future not to drag us prematurely into later era detail for its own sake, but because it illuminates the price embedded in her greatness. When she was present, Aglarond could say no with lightning behind the syllable. When she was gone, the realm had to discover how much of that refusal had been taught into the people and how much had merely been delegated upward to an extraordinary woman. There are political lessons here far beyond Aglarond. Many kingdoms imagine they want heroes. What they want usually is relief. The two are related, but not identical. A true heroic protector buys time for institutions, customs, and ordinary courage to strengthen. A merely overwhelming protector can, if history is unkind or the realm inattentive, become a reason not to do the slower work. Aglarond's story matters because it contains both tendencies at once. The symbol really did shield the kingdom. The kingdom really did develop resilient habits apart from her. Yet the aura of her reign remained so immense that later continuity could not help but feel measured against a storm. This is why I resist calling Aglarond simply the realm of the symbol. That flatters her and diminishes the kingdom. It also repeats the imperial vice of reading small states only through singular personalities. No, Aglarond is older and more textured than any one sovereign. The Yurewood precedes her. Brindor's settlement precedes her. The mixed people precede her. The long Thyan pressure precedes her. The foresters, militias, coast villages, silverwork, bloodwine, menhir circles, old gods half-remembered in glades, and the stubborn domestic habits of a population that never wished outsiders too comfortable, these all precede her. She intensified the realm. She did not invent its soul. Still, to understate her would be dishonest. When neighboring powers told stories about Aglarond, they told them with her silhouette inside the telling. That is power of a rare kind. Not just the ability to destroy armies or unmake schemes, but to alter the narrative field in which states judge one another. They could not think of Aglarond as a manageable minor border realm, while the symbol lived in full command of herself. Every calculation had to pass through her. Every insult risked awakening her. Every intrigue assumed the possibility that some point of the board might spontaneously stop obeying ordinary theory because the Witch Queen had decided enough was enough. I confess a dry respect for this. Nothing improves imperial analysis quite like involuntary uncertainty. And yet, uncertainty is not a constitution. So let us step back from the Queen for a moment and ask the deeper question her reign forces upon us. What exactly is Aglarond refusing? Not merely invasion. That answer is too shallow. No small realm survives for centuries on military negation alone. If all it has is hatred of the neighbor, then the neighbor eventually defines its soul. Aglarond is more impressive than that. It refuses not only conquest, but categories convenient to conquerors. It refuses to become purely human or purely elven. It refuses to let the Yurewood become merely lumber and cover. It refuses to let trade become the master of policy. It refuses to become Thay's mirror in self-defense. It refuses to collapse all power into urban administration. It refuses to forget that sacred places are sometimes strategic places and strategic places often sacred. It refuses, above all, the seductive lie that survival requires self-simplification. That is the heart of the matter. Let us name the mechanisms plainly. How does a small realm resist absorption by larger powers over time? Not by courage alone, though courage is necessary. Not by fortifications alone, though walls and watchposts help. Not even by magical protectors alone, though without such figures, some histories would have ended earlier and in uglier script. A durable refusal usually requires several things at once: First, it requires terrain that multiplies local knowledge and punishes arrogant advance. Aglarond possessed this in the Wood, in its coasts, in its awkward approaches, in the way forest and settlement interlocked. Outsiders could enter, outsiders could even occupy sections. But the land did not become theirs merely because boots stood upon it. They had to understand it. And understanding takes time. Small realms are often excellent at denying. Second, it requires a population whose identity is attached to place more strongly than to abstract ideology. Aglarondans were not merely told by court philosophers that their kingdom mattered. They inhabited its matter. The coast fed them, the wood remembered them. The stones marked thresholds their grandparents could still name. Mixed ancestry, rather than weakening this, deepened it. People who must negotiate belonging in daily life often become more, not less, attached to the places where that negotiation has become home. Third, it requires institutions scaled to reality rather than vanity. Aglarond did not attempt to rival large powers in every category. It built what it could sustain: skilled troops, militias, fortified points, selective magical cultivation, limited trade, representation enough to keep local communities legible to the crown. This is not glorious in the imperial register. It is better. It is proportionate. Realms often die because they become addicted to disproportional ambition. Fourth, it requires a symbolic center strong enough to unify without fully homogenizing. Brindor provided one kind of center. The symbol provided another, far more incandescent kind. Both mattered. A borderland polity that never produces emblematic authority is in danger of fraying into districts. One that produces only emblematic authority is in danger of becoming a cult of personality with farms. Aglarond hovered between those poles and remarkably often kept its footing. Fifth, it requires limits. This may be the most neglected point in all political history. A realm survives partly by knowing what not to do. Do not chase the stronger neighbor onto ground that serves his structure better than yours. Halakar learned this expensively. Do not let trade volumes dictate strategic openness. Do not flatten local cultures merely because centralization flatters administrators. Do not assume that magical excellence excuses civic neglect. Do not mistake every invitation to expansion for an opportunity rather than bait. Aglarond's restraint, imperfect though it was, deserves admiration. Cormier practiced restraint through institutions strong enough to discipline monarchy. Rashomon practiced it through cultural suspicion of imperial forms and the distributed authority of the Witchlerun. Aglarond practiced it through border intelligence, a practical sense that endurance matters more than display when one lives between sea, forest, and hungry states. This is also why I said earlier that Aglarond should not be defined merely by its opposition to Thay. Thay helps clarify Aglarond by contrast, yes. But if Aglarond were only anti-Thay, it would be derivative. In truth, the kingdom's logic is older and richer than that antagonism. The Wood already encoded selective access. The mixed communities already had to negotiate coexistence. The monarchy already embodied a founding compromise between peoples and claims. They intensified Aglarond's defensiveness, but it did not invent the realm's soul. What Thay did was force Aglarond to sharpen pre-existing virtues into strategy. One of those virtues is localism without disintegration. Consider how delicate that balance is. Localism can preserve texture, memory, and practical intelligence. It can also corrode collective action if every village treats the capital as rumor and every district its own universe. Aglarond avoided the worst of this by giving localities real place within the kingdom without making local autonomy synonymous with total exemption from shared defense. Communities knew the crown. The crown knew it needed the communities. A representative council, however imperfectly obeyed at the edges, institutionalized that mutual visibility. The foresters embodied crown service through local expertise rather than against it. Militias meant that defense was not a wholly professionalized external function imposed on civilians, but something residents could understand themselves as helping enact. This is politically profound. A people is more likely to defend a realm if the realm has previously bothered to look back at them. Contrast again with Thay, where state and magical elite stand so far above ordinary persons that loyalty becomes a managed condition rather than reciprocal recognition. Even Mulhorand and Unther, for all their durability, often grounded obedience in sacred hierarchy more than negotiated locality. Aglarond is different. Its mixed and regionally varied population could plausibly see the kingdom as theirs, not because it erased distinctions, but because it was built from them. Do not romanticize that into democratic sweetness. The crown still ruled. Sorcerer's power still mattered. Suspicion, especially in the Yuirwood, remained sharp. Yet the realm's structure asked less uniformity of its inhabitants than many larger powers would have tolerated. That proved an asset. Empires frequently assume that coherence requires sameness. Borderlands know better. Coherence can also arise from disciplined accommodation among differences everyone knows cannot be wished away. Aglarond's layered identities illustrate this beautifully. A person could be coastal and Aglarondan, Yuir descended and Aglarondan, half-elf and loyal to the crown, human and respectful of forest sanctities without fully understanding them, a forester serving royal defense while moving intimately in local woodcraft, or a monarch whose authority depended upon both human settlements and half-elven memory. None of this is tidy. That is precisely why it is durable. Tidy identities crack under pressure because they have too little flex. Aglarond bends. Sometimes bending looks like inconsistency to outsiders. Let them sneer. Outsiders often confuse coherence with symmetry. Aglarond knew that asymmetry can be a strength. The coast and the forest need not resemble one another to remain within the same polity. A ruler may be fantastically arcane, while many subjects prefer magic, remain at arm's length in daily life. A kingdom may respect trade and still limit it. A half-elven founding can later produce human monarchs without collapsing into metaphysical panic. A sacred forest can serve as both spiritual inheritance and military medium. Such complexities are not flaws in need of correction. They are the kingdom's immune system. There is another mechanism of refusal we must not neglect: memory. Not merely grand commemorative memory, though Aglarond had its battles and lineages. I mean domestic memory, the kind held by families, villages, local shrines, old boat names, inherited prejudices, and the small phrases elders use when advising the young never to trust a road too near a border after rain. Realms survive because people remember how danger used to arrive. Perhaps Thayan raiders once came by this coast. Perhaps some old menhir circle opened wrong under a full moon. Perhaps a forester never returned from a stretch of wood now avoided unless compelled. Such memories become folk policy. They thicken caution into tradition. Aglarond profited from this. In a place where outside pressure is chronic, forgetfulness is expensive. That is one reason I find borderland cultures so often wiser than imperial centers. The center mistakes routine for safety. The border remembers that routine is merely the interval between tests. Rashomon, of course, remembers in its own idiom, lodges, witches, spirits, and the disciplined ferocity of a people who know what stands to their south. Aglarond remembers differently. In mixed households, coastal wariness, forest suspicion, the half-elven inheritance of a land won from both human encroachment and older decline, and the long habit of measuring every overture for the hook behind it. Thay, by contrast, remembers chiefly as a ruling caste. Its archive belongs upward. Aglarond's memory is more distributed. Distributed memory is harder to decapitate. That deserves emphasis because the episode's deep dive asks how small realms resist absorption and how charismatic protectors both save and endanger the states that depend on them. One answer to the second problem is this. If the people themselves carry enough memory, then the protector's absence need not erase the strategic culture. The kingdom may suffer, perhaps terribly, but it will not have to invent suspicion from nothing. It will remember how to say no. Aglarond seems, by and large, to have remembered. Even later, when authority shifted after the symbol's disappearance, Yuerwood populations did not simply melt obediently into whatever successor structure claimed legitimacy. They recognized the land. They recognized danger. They also recognized the difference between an earned protector and an institution trying to borrow her aura wholesale. That skepticism could complicate governance. Good. Complicated subjects are often a sign that a realm's civic muscles have not atrophied entirely. The old menhir circles offer a fitting metaphor here. They remained functional in part, faded in part, dangerous in part. Their knowledge was selective. Some opened only under certain conditions. Some misbehaved catastrophically when larger metaphysical crises, such as the spell plague, tore through reality. Yet the circles endured because they were not merely monuments. They were embedded in the place and in the memory of those who cared enough to preserve what could be preserved. Aglarond as a whole resembles that. Not a perfect wall, a working threshold system. Old, local, partial, stubborn, and difficult for outsiders to master without becoming entangled in obligations or dangers they do not understand. This, I think, is why Aglarond attracts the wrong sort of commentary from those who want clean state forms. It does not look efficient enough. It contains too much wood, too much inherited ambiguity, too many mixed populations, too much reliance on local knowledge, too much magic at the crown, and not enough in ordinary administration to satisfy wizardly theorists, too much ordinary labor to flatter romantics, and too much restraint to please imperial nostalgists. Excellent. A realm that displeases all those audiences at once is probably doing something right. Yet let us be severe with it too. Disciplined refusal can curdle. A people trained to say no may forget how to say yes in time. Suspicion can preserve autonomy, but it can also narrow imagination. Limited trade reduces vulnerability, but it can also limit opportunity and leave peripheral communities poor. Strong attachment to local forms can harden into contempt for neighbors within the same polity. Reliance on extraordinary rulers can stunt the cultivation of broader civic confidence. Borderlands, for all my respect, are not automatically virtuous because they are embattled. Pressure preserves some excellencies and distorts others. Aglarond's half-elven and forest communities, for instance, did not always regard the coastal settlements with warmth. Nor did all human Aglarondans move through the Uir inheritance with reverence. Tension between the more elven-inclined communities of the deeper wood and the more humanized edge settlements never vanished simply because the kingdom existed. That is the price of honest mixture. The work is never finished. A realm like Aglarond remains a negotiation in motion, not a solved theorem. Perhaps that is why I admire it so much. Solved theorems do not survive Faerûn. Negotiations sometimes do. Since we are among historians rather than heralds, let us descend once more from abstraction into texture. I want you to see an Aglarondan market at the edge of evening. Not a huge mercantile square like those that flatter Selgant or Kalimport, a smaller place, close enough to the coast that salt rides the air, far enough inland that timber scents sit beneath it. A few fisher families have come up with the day's catch. Farmers bargain over grain and animal feed. Someone from the wood arrives late with carved instruments or worked silver, refusing to sell to the first fool who mistakes patience for timidity. Cloth hangs in practical colors, bronze jewelry flashes on wrists. There are strangers, but not too many. Strangers are never permitted to become atmospheric background in a place like this. They are counted. Not formally, perhaps, though formal counting does occur at need, but socially. Eyes note them. Children stare. A local drinks near enough to overhear. The innkeeper marks accent, boots, and whether the newcomer scans doorways like prey or inspector. This is what I mean when I say vigilance has entered domestic habit. A culture of refusal does not live only in border forts. It lives in how swiftly a room adjusts to novelty. Aglarond's coasts taught this lesson early. Boats do not bring abstraction. They bring people, and people bring price changes, quarrels, gossip, infected cargo, hidden purpose, marriage opportunities, debt collectors, missionaries, and spies. A realm that opens to the sea without learning social filtration becomes somebody else's market sooner or later. Aglarond learned filtration. It did not slam every door. It simply refused to forget that doors exist for a reason. Move now from the market into the Uirwood. The air cools differently. The paths narrow. One begins to understand that the forest is not scenery, but jurisdiction. Houses, where they exist, may look less like declarations of ownership and more like negotiations with the trees. In other places, there are only camps, clearings, small communities, signs of seasonal movement, old stones whose meanings have not been published for the convenience of passing curiosity. Some half-elven folk dress near the settlements more like their human neighbours. Others, deeper in, keep closer to older elven or woodwise forms. Furs, tattoos, garments made for movement rather than courtly appraisal. There are songs here strangers do not know, and perhaps should not. There are stories that begin not with kings, but with glades. This too is politics. The modern mind, by which I mean not your modernity, but the eternal bureaucratic mind, always wants politics to occur where chairs, seals, and minutes are present. Borderlands know politics also occurs wherever a people decides what to preserve from ordinary time. If a song teaches children where not to step under certain moons, that is security policy. If a taboo keeps hunters from disturbing a particular circle of stones, that is conservation, religion, and strategic secrecy all at once. If a village chooses to marry inward, outward, or selectively across communities, that is demographic statecraft, whether anyone drafts a memorandum or not. Aglarond's layered identities, therefore, were not merely census curiosities. They were living decisions, repeated over generations. Coastal humans remained practical, hard-working, not especially eager to make magic a neighborhood pastime, and attached to the settled continuities of farming, fishing, and herding. Yurewood half-elves retained stronger habits of magical practice, especially in more remote stretches, and often a deeper intimacy with the forest's older sacred and strategic structures. Wild elves, where present, preserved still older sensibilities. The kingdom contained all of this. It did not fuse them into homogeneity. It contained them. Containment is not a dirty word when done justly. Sometimes it means making room without insisting upon blur. This has direct consequences for sovereignty. Empires like clean, administrative surfaces. They prefer subjects easily categorized, taxed, mobilized, and ideologically narrated. Aglarond repeatedly denied outsiders that pleasure. To Thay, it must have been maddening. A realm small enough to imagine swallowing, yet socially variegated and geographically tricky enough to make digestion unpleasant. Too mixed to predict by blood. Too local to dominate cleanly from one or two seized cities. Too magical in key places to treat as merely rustic. Too practical in others to collapse if a few ritual sites were profaned. Too attached to forest, coast, and custom to transfer loyalty simply because some more efficient arrangement was announced. This is why I insist that refusal can be an art. Art at its best is disciplined selection. So is survival. Aglarond selected what to let in, what to preserve, what to centralize, what to leave rough, what to entrust to the crown, what to entrust to local memory, and what never to entrust at all. Not perfectly, no polity manages that, but skillfully enough that the kingdom acquired a recognizable shape without becoming mechanically rigid. Let us speak also of violence, because refusal unbacked by violence remains only preference in a world like Faerûn. Aglarond's violence is revealing in style. It tends toward defense, interdiction, localized raid, forest warfare, counter-incursion, and strong response at chosen points rather than toward imperial campaigning. Even its use of coast boats reflects this. Mobility without grand naval bureaucracy. Sharp local action rather than maritime empire. The foresters likewise embody a particular ethic of force. Rangers loyal to the crown, operating in the Yurewood, they represent the kingdom's best translation of local knowledge into official defense. Note the beauty of that. The state does not erase the forest people's expertise. It recruits it. It formalizes just enough of the local to make it durable, without flattening the local into parade ground nonsense. Compare again to Rashomon, which formalizes less and ritualizes more, and to Thay, which formalizes so much that it risks treating every useful difference as something to be standardized or exploited. Aglarond sits between. It is perhaps less romantically cohesive than Rashomon, less administratively fearsome than Thay, but in that middle position lies its distinctive genius. There is a reason kingdoms like this rarely dominate textbooks. They do not generate enough clean spectacle. They are difficult to summarize. And yet they shape history precisely because they endure where simpler polities would either collapse or become somebody else's province. Consider the repeated Thayan pressures across the centuries: military losses, border testing, arcane intimidation, political interference. The temptation to turn Aglarond into either client or cautionary tale must have been constant. Yet the realm persisted. Why? Because each Thayan method encountered not one wall, but many. Some methods struck monarchy and found local memory behind it. Some struck the coast and found forest suspicion behind that. Some struck the forest and found the crown's need for that forest too deeply woven into legitimacy for easy betrayal. Some struck through magic and met the symbol. Others struck through war and met militias, forts, foresters, bad terrain, and a population not naive about the uses of force. Layered defense is not only military, it is civilizational. Aglarond excelled at this. I suspect too that its modesty helped. There is less glory in a small self-sufficient kingdom than in an empire or a magical superstate. Very well, glory is expensive to maintain. Modesty keeps supply lines short. A realm that does not aspire to govern half the world can spend more attention learning the moods of its own woods. It can afford to know the names of small coves, troublesome families, old stone circles, and the difference between a trader who wants tariffs reduced and one who wants docking rights broad enough to become precedents. In governance, as in scholarship, scale can produce ignorance disguised as importance. Aglarond avoided some of that trap simply by being forced to. Necessity sometimes teaches what wisdom would otherwise have required centuries to learn. And then, of course, there is the emotional question. What does it feel like to belong to a realm whose most important civic verb is refusal? Not easy, I think. Not cheerful in the broad and shallow way some prosperous merchant polities can become. Aglarond would foster pride, yes, but pride threaded with caution. It would likely cultivate strong regional loyalties, respect for competence, wariness toward travelers who ask too many questions about roads or stones, gratitude toward defenders mingled with periodic resentment of central authority, and a certain fatigue one sees in populations who know that the neighbors keep existing. Borderlands do not get to conclude history just because they are tired of it. There is dignity in such fatigue. It strips away theatrical illusions. An Aglarondan farmer, fisher, forester, or village elder likely understands sovereignty more concretely than many imperial courtiers ever will. Sovereignty is not a word for festival speeches. It is whether strangers can force terms upon your road, your shrine, your child, your customs, your forest edge, your taxes, your harbor, your dead. Once you understand sovereignty that way, refusal ceases to sound negative. It becomes protective love. This is perhaps the finest thing Aglarond teaches. To say no is not always to withdraw from the world. Sometimes it is to guard the conditions under which a real yes may later remain meaningful. No to conquest, so that alliance may mean something. No to total openness, so that welcome may still be chosen rather than extracted. No to simplification, so that the mixed people of the realm may remain real rather than politically erased. No to imitation of the enemy, so that defense does not become moral surrender, all admirable, all costly, and all made more precarious by the fact that so much of Aglarond's legend clustered around one astonishing woman. We must return then to the danger folded inside rescue. The danger folded inside rescue is easy to praise and hard to govern. A protector of the symbol's magnitude alters more than foreign policy. She alters tempo. A court with such a sovereign can postpone decisions that would otherwise feel urgent. A military commander may act more boldly under the assumption of eventual magical intervention. A village may endure insecurity on the edge of toleration because, after all, the Witch Queen rules in Veltala and the Red Wizards fear her. A young mage may imagine service to the crown less as entry into a constitutional order than as orbit around a singular sun. Even enemies change. They do not cease plotting, but they begin plotting around the person. Remove the person, and all the plots rush inward at once, like air into a chamber whose seal has cracked. This is unfair to the protector. It is also inevitable. Do not misunderstand me. I am not proposing the dreary doctrine that all great figures are secretly bad for the states they save. History would be much thinner if we were only ever permitted to admire committees. Singular protectors can gift a people time, continuity, deterrence, hope, and the chance to remain themselves until institutions catch up. The moral burden lies not in their existence, but in what the surrounding society does with the time purchased. Did Aglarond use that time well? My answer is cautious. Partly. That irritating historian's answer is also the true one. The realm did preserve distributed habits of defense. The Yearwood never forgot its own grammar. Local militias remained meaningful. The monarchy did not wholly dissolve the country into a magical caste system. The mixed populations kept their local textures. In all this, Aglarond showed real resilience. Yet when later events carried the symbol out of the visible order of rule, the kingdom unmistakably suffered the shock of dependency revealed. After her apparent death in 1425 DR, governance passed into the hands of the Simbach Council, an assembly of mages learned in her ways. Such a successor makes a certain practical sense. If a realm has long been defended by a preeminent magical monarch, then those closest to her methods may seem best positioned to maintain continuity. But legitimacy is not merely competence. A council of inheritors is not the person whose existence taught both subject and enemy how to imagine the realm's strength. The council could occupy the palace. It could command soldiers. It could even consolidate power, suppress rebellious outlying regions, and extend Aglarond's authority over disputed territories in later contests with Thay's exiled Zulkirs. And still, the question remained. Were they Aglarond's living No, or merely administrators of its memory? The Uerwood's half-elves and wild elves grew skeptical, as one might have predicted. Their acceptance of the symbol had not been equivalent to transferable affection for anyone who claimed succession through proximity. This should not be read merely as provincial obstinacy. It is a sophisticated political instinct. Populations accustomed to singular protectors often sense with unnerving accuracy when successors are wielding legitimacy second-hand. They may obey, they may calculate, they may even cooperate, but they do not confuse inheritance with embodiment. That distinction is one of the cruelest in politics. A kingdom can inherit a throne, a palace, an army, a seal, and a title. It cannot inherit a person. This is why charismatic protectors both save and endanger the states that depend upon them. They gather trust into themselves with such force that any later regime, however competent, governs in comparative weather. Subjects remember not only policies, but presence. Enemies remember not only capabilities, but fear. Bureaucrats attempt continuity and discover that the hardest thing to archive is the moral atmosphere produced by a singular life. Aglarond's experience is therefore not peculiar. It is exemplary. Again and again in Faerûn, realms sheltered by extraordinary figures discover, after those figures are gone, that deterrence must be relearned in institutional language. Some fail, some overcorrect into sterile administration, some descend into cultic nostalgia, mistaking endless invocation of the Great Protector for a substitute for new strategy. Aglarond, to its credit, did not wholly disintegrate into any one of these pathologies. But neither was it spared them entirely. This gives the episode its sharpest lesson. Disciplined refusal must become cultural, not merely personal, if it is to last. In Aglarond, I think it did become cultural. The realm's long history proves as much, yet the symbol's magnitude revealed how difficult it is to know whether a culture truly possesses its own courage until the giant hand at its back is withdrawn. One sees the same principle, though under different moral signs, elsewhere. Cormyr sometimes risked over-identifying the realm with its best monarchs, yet survived because institutions remained dense enough to carry continuity. Rashemen diffused protective authority more broadly through Wicklaran, lodges, spirits, and local oaths, thereby reducing overdependence on any single figure while accepting the cost of opacity. Thay, interestingly, avoids this precise problem in one register because its organization is so viciously institutional, yet it suffers the mirror danger of making the state durable even when the persons atop it are monstrous. Aglarond falls between these poles, more personal than Cormyr, less distributed than Rashemen, far less bureaucratically self-propelling than Thay. That in-between quality is often the true borderland position. Not indecision, synthesis under pressure. The Uerwood deepens this analysis still further, for it reminds us that Aglarond's protector problem predates the symbol in another form. Long before her, the Star Elves of Uiresh-Anyar confronted pressure by creating Sildeuir and withdrawing. That too was a kind of dependence on extraordinary magical solution. It preserved part of a people. It also left others behind, and changed the social future of the peninsula irrevocably. One could say, if one were feeling particularly stern, that the region has repeatedly solved impossible pressures through singular acts. High magic withdrawal, founding conquest translated into monarchy, witch-queen deterrence, and then asked later generations to make ordinary life out of the aftermath. That is a harsh inheritance. It is also a profoundly Faerûnian one. Much of our history is exactly this: the children of extraordinary solutions trying to build durable routines from miracle, catastrophe, or both. This is where Aglarond becomes larger than itself. It is not merely an eastern kingdom with pretty woods and an inconvenient queen. It is a meditation on how communities live after being repeatedly saved in ways that cannot simply be repeated. The Yuir cannot found Yuir-Shanyar anew. The Star Elves cannot keep departing into fresh extraplanar refuge whenever history grows tiresome. Brindor cannot fight Ingdal's arm every generation. The symbol cannot be succeeded by manufacturing another symbol from surplus will and flattering rumors. At some point, the realm must live on habits, institutions, local loyalties, memory, and the difficult ordinary courage of people who know the old miracle will not arrive simply because the old danger has. This is why the later skepticism of Yuirwood folk toward the Simbark Council matters so much. It is not just post-heroic grumbling. It is the population itself testing whether the culture of refusal still belongs to them or has been captured by professional inheritors. That is a healthy, if inconvenient, test. No good archive has ever been made more accurate by convenience. No good kingdom either. If I sound sympathetic to Aglarond's trouble here, it is because the trouble is honest. Better a realm wrestling with how to remain itself after the loss of a true protector than one that never had enough selfhood to notice when protector and owner became the same role. Better suspicion than anesthetized obedience. Better contested continuity than seamless capture. Still, we must not pretend the cost is light. There is grief in living after a great defender. There is strategic confusion. There are officials who mistake inheritance for capacity. There are neighbors who smell weakness and press. There are local communities tired of being symbols in someone else's theory of state survival. There are young people born too late to remember the protector clearly, and therefore vulnerable to both nostalgic exaggeration and cynical dismissal. There are also, inevitably, opportunists who wear the old loyalty like a borrowed cloak while reaching for different ambitions underneath. Aglarond knew all this. Of course it did. That is what happens when your history is written between forest roots and imperial teeth. Yet perhaps the finest compliment one can pay the realm is this. Even when singular protectors faded, the kingdom remained thinkable. It did not become impossible to imagine Aglarond without the symbol, only painful. That distinction matters immensely. If a state cannot be imagined without one ruler, it was never truly a state, only a dependency in ceremonial dress. Aglarond was more than that. The debate after her showed as much. People argued because there was a realm worth arguing over. A smaller truth, but a lovely one, lies in the persistence of local craft and custom through all this. Blood wine still pressed, instruments still carved, coast boats still repaired, forest paths still known by those who kept them, children still raised amid stories older than current offices, Such continuities are easy to overlook when dazzled by great names. Do not. They are the muscles by which a civilization lifts the weight bought for it by its heroes. In the end, perhaps, that is Aglarond's answer to the danger of charismatic salvation. Let the heroes save, then insist that the people continue. Continue in enough stubborn particularity that no later conqueror, neighbor, or successor council can tell the land what it is in a voice entirely foreign to those who live there. So where does that leave us? With a small kingdom, yes. With a borderland, yes. With a mixed people and an old forest and a famously terrible queen, certainly. But also with one of Faerûn's clearest demonstrations that survival need not imitate empire in order to count as political seriousness. Aglarond is not impressive because it conquered widely. It did not. It is not impressive because it achieved some final harmony among its peoples. It did not. It is not impressive because it abolished fear, contradiction, or dependence on exceptional individuals. Again, it did not. It is impressive because, under conditions that should have simplified it into either a conquered province or a harsher imitation of its enemies, it remained itself. That is no small achievement. To remain oneself under pressure is one of the rarest civilizational arts. Most peoples change, naturally enough. Some enrich themselves by doing so, others adapt wisely. Aglarond did both. But the key is that the changes were not total capitulations to outside grammar. Human settlement came, and the realm did not become merely a human coast. Elven inheritance lingered, and the realm did not become merely a nostalgic forest memory. Great magic guarded it, and the realm did not become merely a wizard state. Threats from Thay sharpened it, and the realm did not become merely anti-Thay. The kingdom kept refusing reduction. That, my apprentice, is what I mean by the art of saying no. It is not petulance. It is not cowardice. It is not simple withdrawal. It is the disciplined practice of preserving conditions under which a people may continue to be complicated in their own way. Aglarond said no to conquest so that mixed life could continue. No to simplification so that Yuirwood memory and coastal practicality could remain in the same political body. No to overexpansion so that its limited strength would not be spent flattering pride. No to unbounded trade so that prosperity would not become dependency. No to magical oligarchy so that magic might defend the realm without entirely reorganizing society in the image of the gifted. No to the fantasy of purity so that a half-elven kingdom could still call itself real. No to forgetting the old forest merely because newer harbors paid taxes. And after the age of the symbol, no to easy succession myths that pretended inheritance alone could reproduce presence. This is why Aglarond makes such a fine companion piece to Rashemen and Thay. Rashemen taught us a culture of resistance rooted in right, spirit, and decentralized sacred authority. Thay taught us the terror of organized power sharpened into hierarchy and export. Aglarond stands between them, neither masked witchland nor magical oligarchy, but a border monarchy of layered peoples and strategic restraint. If Rashemen is defiance through inward coherence, and thigh domination through outward organization, then Aglarond is refusal through negotiated durability. I confess I find that beautiful. Melancholic, yes. Difficult, yes. But beautiful. For Aglarond reminds us that kingdoms need not be neat to be worthy. They need not be large to matter. They need not resolve every contradiction in order to build continuity. Sometimes a realm earns its dignity simply by carrying unresolved inheritances, without letting stronger neighbors define what those inheritances mean. There is a lesson here for archivists too. One must be careful not to judge a people solely by the categories their enemies find convenient. Thayan strategists would prefer Aglarond be read as an obstacle. Imperial historians might prefer it be read as an anomaly. Romantic bards might flatten it into the kingdom of the symbol, as though one could take the whole forest, the whole bloodline knot, the whole coast-born vigilance, and fit it politely inside a single sorceress's silhouette. No. Aglarond is older, denser, and more instructive than that. It is a land where the dead Yuir still shape the living through stone circles and remembered pantheons. A land where human colonists became subjects of a half-elf king after overreaching. A land where forests are political actors. A land where militia duty and boat repair belong in the same civilizational sentence as high sorcery. A land whose people have had to learn, generation after generation, that saying no is not enough unless one also preserves something worth the refusal. That last sentence, I think, is the whole kingdom in miniature. What is the no for? That is always the question. Aglarond answers, for continuity without surrender, for mixture without erasure, for sacred places that remain more than surveyed resource, for households that may go on naming their dead in their own idiom, for villages that need not learn to flatter red wizards, for the right to be complicated beyond an empire's patience.